June 19, 1944. Philippine Sea. A sky the color of molten steel pressed low over the Pacific, its horizon smeared with oil and cordite. Beneath it, the water boiled with wakes and contrails, with torpedoes and planes screaming toward their targets. Out beyond the rolling swells, 20,000 feet below, the unseen hunters of the American Navy moved in silence. The submarines, sleek, diesel-electric beasts, stalked the Imperial Japanese convoys like phantoms. Above, Japanese carrier decks bristled with aircraft, but below the surface a quieter war was underway, one that Tokyo's admirals had fatally underestimated. In Tokyo's naval headquarters, maps showed vast stretches of blue still under the rising sun's dominion. Yet those maps were lies. Beneath the waves, the Americans already owned the sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been forged for decisive battles, massive fleet actions, gun against gun, carrier against carrier. Submarine warfare, to Japanese planners, was a sideshow, an honorable but secondary game of fleet reconnaissance and capital ship ambush. The Americans, by contrast, had begun to understand something far more radical. Their submarines were not just scouts or assassins of enemy warships. They were commerce killers, strangling Japan's lifeline of oil, steel, and food. By mid-1944, as the Battle of the Philippine Sea raged above, Japanese merchant crews whispered of monsters below, of torpedoes that appeared from nowhere, of convoys that never reached port. Each loss rippled through the empire's fragile supply web. Yet in the minds of many admirals, the nightmare still hadn't registered. Their great fleet, Yamato, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, was supposed to dominate the ocean. But the ocean had turned against them. In the long Pacific dusk of 1942 and 1943, American submarines learned their trade in blood and mechanical failure. Torpedoes often ran too deep or exploded prematurely. Crews wrestled with engines, leaky valves, and depth charges. But each patrol was a lesson carved in steel and salt water. By 1944, the lessons had coalesced into a weapons system of astonishing reach. Submarines like USS Harder, USS Tang, and USS Barb slipped through minefields, ambushed convoys, and then vanished into the thermocline. Japanese destroyer crews dropped depth charges in frantic patterns, listening for the hollow ping of contact, but too often found only silence. The Americans had cracked the code of the undersea war: aggressive skippers, better tactics, and soon, better torpedoes. What had once been a nuisance was now a scythe cutting Japan's merchant fleet to ribbons that on the surface, convoys tried to hug coastlines, zigzag in darkness, or move under cover of storms. None of it mattered. Radar had turned night into day for the Americans. Sonar and radio direction finding gave them hunter's eyes in a world without light. When a submarine surfaced after dark, its silhouette against the horizon was almost invisible. Its diesel engines were muffled by the sea's own roar. A torpedo streaked unseen beneath the waves, leaving only a feathery track, then struck with a shuddering blast that could rip a 10,000-ton freighter in half. Survivors bobbed in oil-slick water, staring at the distant periscope, wondering how such a small vessel could wield so much destruction. From Tokyo, reports arrived too late, incomplete, or unbelievable. Merchant losses mounted, tonnage charts bled red ink. Yet staff officers reassured their superiors. The Americans could not be everywhere. And yet, somehow they were. Each new offensive in the Solomons or the Marianas found Japanese logistics hollowed out before the first shells landed. Submarines were silently writing the empire's obituary months before the battles were fought. Even the mighty Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, became a prisoner of its own fuel shortages. An armored titan that could barely leave harbor without risking its lifeline to submarines lurking beyond, beneath these waves. The American crews lived a strange, compressed life. The air was always damp, heavy with diesel and sweat. Red lights glowed along the narrow passageways, turning men's faces into haunted masks. At battle stations, silence reigned except for the clicking of valves and the quiet orders of the captain. They heard the distant thump of depth charges, felt the hull ring under pressure, and still waited, poised, for the perfect firing solution. This was not the surface war of banners and air wings. It was a knife fight in darkness. every move calculated, every mistake fatal. Yet in that silence, they were shaping the war more profoundly than any carrier strike. Japanese countermeasures lagged behind. Their sonar sets were crude, their anti-submarine doctrine thin, and their escort ships too few. They had built their navy to fight Mahan's decisive battle, not an attritional campaign beneath the waves. In 1944, this strategic blind spot became lethal. When Admiral Somu Toyota studied the lost figures, he felt the floor tilt beneath him. Tankers, transports, even troop ships, gone. The Americans were winning without announcing it, bleeding Japan until its war machine could no longer move. In the annals of naval warfare, no empire had lost control of its sea lanes so quietly, so completely to the tactical level. This was also a story of technology and nerve. Improved torpedoes like the Mark 18 electric left no telltale wake. Submarines carried radar sets salvaged from aircraft programs, allowing them to stalk convoys even in squalls. American cryptographers fed patrol captains intelligence on convoy routes gleaned from Japanese codes. Each advantage compounded the next. The hunter no longer groped for prey. He knew where it would be, when it would arrive, and how it would move. For Japanese admirals raised on the idea of decisive fleet actions, it was as though the ocean itself had turned traitor. Yet perhaps the most devastating blow was psychological. Merchant captains sailed with a sense of doom. Sailors whispered about the steel sharks that never slept. Convoy commanders feared their escorts would not protect them, and indeed, often they could not. Each sinking sent not just ships, but also morale to the bottom. As the Undersea campaign gathered momentum, the once unquestioned invincibility of Japan's empire dissolved. By the time carrier aircraft dueled above the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the outcome had been foreshadowed below it. The Americans owned the ocean floor, and from there they dictated who lived and who starved on that June morning. As Japanese pilots prepared for what they believed would be a decisive blow against the U.S. Pacific Fleet, convoys far behind them were already being ripped apart. Oil that would never arrive, aircraft parts that would never reach airfields, food that would never reach garrisons, all lost to submarines whose periscopes rose and fell like ghosts of the deep. It was a war waged out of sight, but not out of consequence. In the shadows, the balance of power had shifted. The empire of the rising sun had built its fleets for thunderclaps and saber strokes. The Americans had chosen a different weapon, the slow, relentless choke of undersea warfare. The Philippine Sea battle would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for the devastating losses inflicted on Japanese aviation. But beneath that spectacle lay an even greater attrition, one invisible to cameras and war correspondents. The ocean itself had become a battlefield where the Americans, not the Japanese, held the initiative. Submarines prowled the shipping lanes from the Kuriles to the South China Sea, drawing an iron curtain around the home islands. It was a campaign of patience, precision, and unsung heroism, one that Tokyo's admirals had never prepared to fight. By nightfall of June 19th. As fires burned on the water and the sky turned black with oil smoke, the silent war continued. Another Japanese freighter slipped beneath the waves, another lifeline severed. The surface war raged on, but the undersea war had already decided its outcome. Japanese admirals stared at their maps, not yet believing what the loss columns told them. But the sea had changed sides, and the submarines, silent, unseen, unstoppable, now ruled by the summer of 1941. The Pacific was already tilting toward confrontation, though neither Tokyo nor Washington fully grasped the scale of what was coming. Japan's war machine had devoured China's coastlines, seized Indochina, and cast its eyes on the Dutch East Indies. Oil, rubber, and steel were the empire's lifeblood, but every barrel, every ton, had to move across thousands of miles of open water. The Imperial Navy's planners built a strategy rooted in Mahan's doctrine: decisive battle, concentrated fleets, and control of sea lanes through overwhelming surface power. Submarines, in their doctrine, were extensions of the fleet, reconnaissance, pickets, and opportunistic attackers against warships. Commerce raiding was regarded as secondary, even unworthy of a great power's navy. This cultural bias would shape the Pacific War in ways Japan's admirals could scarcely imagine. Across the ocean, the U.S. Navy watched with growing alarm. American war planners understood Japan's dependence on maritime supply lines and, in pre-war studies, envisioned submarine warfare as a crucial weapon of economic strangulation. Yet in December 1941, when Japanese carrier planes struck Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleships lay in ruins and its surface power was gutted. Only submarines emerged relatively intact, thrust overnight from supporting role to frontline predator. What had been an auxiliary force now became the spear tip of America's counteroffensive. By necessity, a doctrine of unrestricted submarine warfare was declared the same day as the attack, a move without precedent in American naval history. In the first year. However, reality lagged behind ambition. The U.S. Navy's undersea arm was untested. Skippers were cautious, training was rigid, and the Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon the fleet depended upon, was fatally flawed. It ran too deep, its magnetic exploder often malfunctioned, and even its contact pistols failed under ideal conditions. Submariners risked their lives only to watch torpedoes pass beneath enemy hulls or strike and dud. Japanese convoys slipped through gaps, and American patrol reports returned with frustration. Still, each mission taught lessons. Commanders who dared, who closed in at night on the surface, or attacked in daylight under the guns of escorts, began to rewrite tactics. Aggression, not caution, became the new creed. Meanwhile, Japan's confidence swelled. Early victories in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies gave the impression of invincibility. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's carriers had reshaped naval warfare at Pearl Harbor and off Ceylon, but his submarines, designed as scouts for the fleet, rarely struck merchant traffic. Japanese naval leadership saw convoy duty as a distraction from offensive operations. Escorts were few and poorly trained. Anti-submarine weapons lagged far behind British or American counterparts. This left the empire's merchant marine exposed. Its thousands of ships crewed by civilians pressed into a war economy already straining under demand. Throughout 1942, as battles raged at Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal, a quieter struggle evolved beneath the Pacific's endless swells. American submarines began to press deeper into Japanese-controlled waters, through the South China Sea, the approaches to Formosa, and the Bungo Strait. They mapped shipping lanes, studied patterns, and coordinated with cryptographers in Hawaii who were breaking Japanese naval codes. Slowly, a deadly lattice formed. By identifying choke points and predictable routes, submarines turned vast oceans into ambush corridors. Japanese merchant losses climbed. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff received reports but still failed to grasp the cumulative effect. They expected the decisive fleet action that would end American resistance, not a campaign of attrition that would erode their own ability to wage war. The difference in strategic philosophy was stark. The U.S. Navy, forced to rebuild its surface fleet, embraced a form of total war at sea. Submarines were not just tactical tools, but strategic instruments to crush Japan's economic underpinnings. The Imperial Navy, wedded to a vision of grand naval duels, neglected to defend its lifelines. This asymmetry grew sharper as the war dragged on. Every Japanese offensive became a gamble, its success predicated on fragile supply lines, its fleets burning fuel faster than it could be replaced. Every American patrol increased the odds of catastrophe. Another tanker lost, another convoy scattered on shore. American industry fed this doctrine. Shipyards at Portsmouth, Mare Island, and Manitowoc cranked out Gatto and Balao-class submarines with assembly line precision. Each new boat was faster, deeper diving, and equipped with better sonar, radar, and communications gear. Crews rotated, veterans trained newcomers, and a growing cadre of aggressive officers were willing to take risks. By 1943, the once disorganized submarine force had become a professional hunter-killer arm, moving in coordinated wolfpacks, sharing intelligence through encrypted channels, and pushing into Japanese home waters. The shift from a cautious, scattered effort to a focused offensive mirrored America's broader industrial and military transformation. Japanese admirals clung to illusions of control. They built the super battleship Yamato, a symbol of national pride and naval supremacy, even as their merchant fleet dwindled. They dispatched submarines on far-flung missions to scout or attack warships, while tankers went unprotected. They underestimated the time and skill needed to build escort destroyers, train sonar operators, or develop effective depth charges. By the time convoy systems were belatedly organized in 1944, it was already too late. The ocean had become a killing ground, the Americans dictating the terms of passage. This context sets the stage for the undersea revolution of 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea was not an isolated clash, but the visible crest of a submerged campaign years in the making. Behind every flaming Japanese aircraft and every burning carrier deck stood months of attrition, of freighters sunk and oil denied, of a strategy invisible to the public but lethal to the empire. American submarines had become the shadow fleet, waging war not for headlines but for strangulation. By mid-war, the unseen struggle for the sea lanes determined the outcome of the surface battles yet to be fought. For the sailors of both nations, this shift was visceral. Japanese crews faced dwindling supplies, extended deployments, and the creeping realization that their ocean fortress had become porous. American submariners felt the tide turning too. Each successful patrol meant not only tonnage sunk, but also a piece of the Japanese war machine dismantled. The clash of doctrines, technologies, and cultures converged beneath the waves, setting the conditions for the decisive undersea campaign that would soon unfold. The result was a paradox the Japanese admirals could hardly accept. They had built a navy to project power across the Pacific, yet their ships increasingly became prisoners of the very sea they sought to command. American submarines, once an afterthought, had emerged as the empire's most dangerous foe. By 1944, when carrier battles blazed across the Marianas, the real war for Japan's survival had already been decided, not on the surface, but beneath it, in the darkness where diesel engines hummed and torpedoes whispered death. They had called it the silent service, but by late 1943 it had become something else entirely, a phantom armada wielding an invisible edge. From Tokyo's naval headquarters, the reports seemed impossible. Tankers and freighters vanishing at a rate no strategist had predicted. Convoys struck in mid-ocean as if by clairvoyance. Japanese admirals believed in fate, in chance encounters, and in bad weather or bad luck. But what they could not see was the hidden lattice of American advantage knitting the Pacific together. This was no random disruption. It was systematized, coordinated, and driven by technologies and doctrines the Imperial Navy had never imagined. The Americans had seized control of the unseen domains, intelligence, communication, and detection, and transformed their submarines from lone predators into a synchronized pack. It was this secret edge, rather than any single weapon, that gave them the power to strangle an empire. The first component was information. Months before a Japanese convoy left port, its course was often already known. American cryptographers at Pearl Harbor's Station HYPO, and later at the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, had cracked Japanese naval codes with increasing speed. Messages once encrypted with seemingly unbreakable ciphers now yielded route schedules, tonnage manifests, and escort rosters. This intelligence flowed through encrypted channels to submarine commanders at sea. Armed with this knowledge, a captain no longer prowled blindly. He could plan intercept points, time his approach to moonlight and tide, and attack with uncanny precision. For Japanese admirals raised on the art of maneuver, it felt like witchcraft. The second component was communication. Pre-war doctrine treated submarines as isolated stalkers, each hunting alone, cut off from higher command once submerged. But by 1943, the Americans had revolutionized undersea coordination. Secure high-frequency radios, and later more compact very low-frequency (VLF) sets, allowed submarines to receive orders and share contact reports even while on patrol. Wolfpacks, once the hallmark of the German U-boat campaign, now took shape under Pacific waters. A single sighting by one boat could summon others to converge, boxing in convoys from multiple angles. Japan's merchants found themselves caught in invisible nets, their evasive maneuvers futile against predators working from a common map. Then came the revolution in detection. Radar, mounted on submarine conning towers, pierced the night and the monsoon squalls alike. Where Japanese escorts relied on human eyes and primitive sound gear, American skippers scanned for silhouettes at 20,000 yards, plotted intercepts, and surfaced at night for high-speed chases. Sonar, improved hydrophones, and even radar detectors to sense enemy search beams turned the hunter into a ghost. The Japanese never developed an effective radar network at sea. Their ships often steamed blind, while American submarines tracked them in 3 dimensions. Even the weapons themselves had been reborn. After a bitter, dangerous year of complaints and experiments, the defective Mark 14 torpedo was corrected, and its magnetic exploder finally worked as designed. New models arrived. The Mark 18 electric, which left no surface wake, and the Mark 23, a stripped-down high-speed version. Warheads grew heavier, and detonation became more reliable. A single spread could obliterate a convoy's core tanker, setting off sympathetic detonations among escorts and cargo ships. The Japanese Navy, slow to adopt convoys or build escorts, lacked the depth charge patterns and acoustic torpedoes needed to counter such strikes. Each technological gain for the Americans widened the gap further, but perhaps the most decisive edge was cultural. The U.S. Navy's submarine command learned from failure, rotated aggressive officers into command, and rewarded risk-takers. Men like Dudley "Mush" Morton, Richard O'Kane, and Eugene Fluckey rewrote the playbook with daring surface attacks, shallow water penetrations, and night surface runs at speeds equal to destroyers. Japanese doctrine remained rigid, steeped in honor and procedure. Convoy escorts clung to predictable formations. Merchant captains obeyed route orders even when losses mounted. The Americans exploited this predictability, turning Japan's disciplined shipping lanes into kill zones. To Tokyo's naval staff, the reports were bewildering. They had assumed submarines to be an adjunct, not a decisive arm. Yet by late 1943, shipping losses neared catastrophic proportions. Steel mills slowed for want of ore. Refineries stood idle without crude. Garrisons starved for lack of rice. And still the convoys sailed into the jaws of a foe they could not see. Japanese admirals demanded more escorts, but shipyards already strained to replace merchant hulls and build carriers. They demanded better sonar, but research lagged behind. They demanded counterintelligence, but American codebreakers stayed one step ahead. Every solution came too late. This hidden advantage extended beyond the technical into the strategic. Because submarines were now so effective, the Americans could concentrate their surface fleets for offensive thrusts, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, knowing their logistics were protected and the enemies were collapsing. Submarines acted as a force multiplier, reducing the Imperial Navy's ability to respond, to reinforce, and to maneuver. By the time the Japanese attempted a counterstroke, their fuel reserves had dwindled, their shipyards lacked critical materials, and their merchant fleet had shrunk to a shadow of its former self. The Undersea War had become the quiet axis around which the entire Pacific campaign turned at in Japanese war colleges. Officers studied past conflicts, Tsushima, Jutland, Mahan's writings, searching for clues to regain initiative. Yet nothing in their textbooks explained the invisible web now strangling their empire. The Americans had fused signals intelligence, radar, radio coordination, and aggressive doctrine into a single war-winning instrument. It was less a matter of one innovation than of synergy, of multiple threads woven into a net from which no convoy escaped. This was the hidden engine of the Pacific War's second half. Invisible to civilians, but devastatingly clear to any sailor watching his freighter explode in a blossom of fire at night. The consequences were staggering. By the end of 1943, nearly 2 million tons of Japanese shipping had been sunk. By the end of 1944, the total would more than double. Entire routes to Southeast Asia became death traps. Tankers ran half-empty or not at all. The Imperial Navy, starved of fuel, could no longer train pilots at full throttle or sortie its heavy units without gambling on the last drops in its bunkers. The super battleships sat in port like stranded leviathans, powerful but inert. The Americans had not only seized the initiative, they had taken Japan's future hostage. Thus, when Japanese admirals in 1944 stared at the Pacific maps, they saw a reality inverted. Their surface fleet, once the instrument of dominance, had been neutered by undersea pressure. Their convoys, once arteries of conquest, had become liabilities. They had underestimated the enemy's ability to innovate, to adapt, and to integrate. The hidden advantage, this triad of intelligence, communication, and technology, had become the decisive weapon. Beneath the waves, beyond the reach of their battleships and carrier planes, the Americans controlled the very medium on which Japan's empire floated. It was a victory not of spectacle, but of systems, a quiet mastery that would soon break the rising sun. They were machines built for silence, yet engineered with the precision of a cathedral clock. By 1944, American submarines had become some of the most complex war machines afloat, steel predators bristling with sensors, torpedoes, and hidden power. To grasp how they ruled the Pacific's underworld, one must dive beneath the waves, through their pressure hulls, and into the humming compartments where men and machines fused. Here, the technological revolution was as decisive as any surface battle. In every rivet and circuit lay the blueprint of Japan's maritime downfall. The Gato and Balao-class submarines formed the backbone of this undersea arm. Each stretched more than 300 feet, its cigar-shaped hull double-layered for depth and strength. The Gato could dive to 300 feet under combat conditions. The Balao, with thicker high-tensile steel, surpassed 400 feet, beyond the reach of most Japanese depth charges. Their pressure hulls were wrapped in ballast tanks that could flood in seconds, sending the vessel plunging into the thermocline, where sound scattered and sonar lost its bite. Inside, a labyrinth of passageways connected torpedo rooms, engine spaces, radio shacks, and the control room, a nerve center lined with polished brass gauges and gyro compasses glowing in red light. Propulsion came from 4 General Motors or Fairbanks Morse diesel engines linked to electric generators. On the surface, the diesels drove the shafts directly, surging to 21 knots in bursts, fast enough to chase a convoy under cover of night. Submerged, the same generators powered massive batteries, propelling the boat at a quieter 9 knots. This duality, diesel above, electric below, was the beating heart of undersea warfare. Skilled engineering crews could switch modes in moments, cutting engines, sealing vents, and gliding into the black depths, while Japanese sonar operators listened for echoes that no longer came at the weapon's core lay the torpedoes. The notorious Mark 14, after endless trials and disasters, had been tamed. Now it ran true, with a 643-pound Torpex warhead and improved contact exploder. Alongside it, the Mark 18 electric torpedo arrived, borrowed from German designs, but refined in American factories. With no visible wake, it left escorts guessing until impact. Submarines carried up to 24 torpedoes, bow and stern tubes combined, allowing multiple attacks across a single patrol. Some boats even mounted 5-inch deck guns to finish crippled freighters or dual small escorts, though by 1944 the real killing came from beneath. Above this lethal hardware hung a web of electronics. SD and SJ radar sets sprouted from retractable masts on the conning tower, turning night into day. The SJ could detect a convoy at more than 10 miles. The radar operator, peering at a green phosphor screen, could plot bearings and range in seconds. Combined with TDC, the torpedo data computer, and analog fire control brain, the captain could feed in target speed, angle on the bow, and range, then receive firing solutions at a glance. This marriage of radar and computation allowed attacks at ranges and angles unthinkable in 1942. Japanese ships still relied on lookouts straining against darkness. The Americans hunted with electronic eyes. Radio was another silent weapon. Each boat carried a high-frequency receiver, later supplemented by very low-frequency gear capable of receiving dispatches even while submerged at periscope depth. Encrypted orders from Comsubpack could redirect an entire patrol group based on intercepted Japanese messages. Submarines began to work in coordinated patrol lines, exchanging contact reports through bursts of radio signals so short they were almost impossible to triangulate. Where Japanese admirals saw chaos, the Americans saw a grid, a living, shifting trap tightening around every shipping lane. Crew life mirrored this technological density. In the control room, sailors stood elbow to elbow at ballast panels, sonar consoles, and navigation tables. The air smelled of oil, ozone, and sweat. The temperature swung from freezing to sweltering, depending on depth and engine load. Yet even under pressure, routine was absolute. Every valve had its mark, every gauge its tolerance. Men memorized emergency procedures, flooding, fire, and silent running. In these cramped tubes, technology was not an abstraction but a daily ritual of survival. A slip of the hand, a missed sound contact, could mean the hull crushed like an eggshell. Japanese anti-submarine measures lagged hopelessly. Their sonar sets, derived from pre-war European models, lacked range and discrimination. Their depth charges had limited explosive power and shallow settings, often failing to reach American boats diving deep. Escort doctrine remained rigid, with predictable search patterns and poor coordination between ships. Radar was virtually absent on many convoy escorts until late 1944, leaving them blind in the hours when American submarines preferred to surface and attack at speed. Even when Japanese scientists produced acoustic homing torpedoes or better sonar, production was minuscule compared to American output. Behind the scenes, American industry poured resources into undersea warfare as if it were a Manhattan Project of the deep. Shipyards in Connecticut and California launched new submarines monthly. Motorola, RCA, and Western Electric churned out radios and radar sets. Westinghouse built the TDCs with clockmaker's precision. Training schools from New London to Pearl Harbor graduated sonar men, electricians, and fire control technicians by the thousands. This industrial surge meant that every patrol left port with better tools than the last. Every refit added a new edge, new periscopes, quieter propellers, and improved batteries. Numbers tell part of the story. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Navy had over 200 submarines in commission in the Pacific, rotating through wolfpacks that blanketed Japan's shipping lanes. Each could range thousands of miles, loiter for weeks, and sink more tonnage in a single patrol than an entire cruiser division could with guns. Combined tonnage sunk approached 5 million by early 1945. Tankers, transports, and troop ships erased from the ledger. Japanese shipping, once the artery of empire, had been reduced to a trickle, often forced to sail under cover of darkness without escort, gambling against predators equipped with radar and code-breaking intelligence that in the technical sphere as in the tactical. The Americans had turned disadvantage into mastery. Losing the battleships at Pearl Harbor had freed resources for submarines. The desperate early war had forged a cadre of inventive officers. The defective torpedoes had compelled rigorous testing and innovation. Each failure became a springboard. By 1944, the cumulative effect was staggering. An undersea fleet faster, deeper, more lethal, and more coordinated than anything Japan could field. It was not merely a matter of superior machines, but of systems engineering applied to war at sea. Inside Japan's naval general staff, the realization dawned too late. Reports described submarines striking simultaneously hundreds of miles apart, attacks coordinated as if guided by a single hand. Tankers disappeared before reaching fuel-hungry carriers, or carriers sank before offloading steel for war production. The Americans, with their radar, radios, and refined torpedoes, had knit the Pacific into a hunter's grid. What the Admirals had once dismissed as a nuisance had become an existential threat, a slow, grinding, technology-driven noose closing around their empire by early 1945. This deep-tech war had reached its apogee. American submarines prowled even the approaches to Japan's home islands, ambushing shipping within sight of coastal lighthouses. Surface escorts were outmatched, sonar operators exhausted, and supply lines shredded. The great gamble of the Imperial Navy, building for a decisive surface battle rather than the prosaic grind of escort and convoy, had failed. In the dark compartments of Balao-class boats, amid the glow of radar scopes and the whir of torpedo gyros, the true architects of maritime victory were at work. Unseen but decisive, September 1944. The Lorraine plain near the French town of Ericourt was a graveyard of steel. But in the Pacific that same month, another battlefield stretched invisible across the South China Sea. Here, in waters as deep as mountain valleys and as wide as continents, the most decisive campaign of the Undersea War reached its crescendo. Convoys bearing oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan's wharf factories steamed north, escorted by overworked destroyers and corvettes. Waiting for them were American submarines armed with perfected torpedoes, coordinated by radio, and guided by decoded Japanese signals. This was the moment when undersea warfare turned from harassment into annihilation. A single, devastating campaign that proved Japan could no longer sustain its empire. One of the most telling engagements began on the night of September 10, 1944. USS Growler, USS Pampanito, and USS Celian formed a coordinated Wolfpack under the command of Captain Swede Momsen. Their target, a massive Japanese convoy codenamed HI-72, 13 ships strong, including troop transports and oil tankers, escorted by destroyers and Kaiboken escorts. Radio intelligence from Hawaii had given the Wolfpack the convoy's departure point, course, and speed. The submarines spread out across the projected track like chess pieces arranged for checkmate. Long before the Japanese lookouts spotted anything, the hunters were already submerged, their periscopes slicing the swells like black needles. As dusk fell, Pampanito's radar caught the first blips at 20,000 yards. The convoy moved in columns, zigzagging half-heartedly, plumes of exhaust marking each transport. In the control rooms, the submariners whispered numbers, bearing, range, and angle on the bow, feeding the TDCs that whirred and clicked like mechanical hearts. Torpedo tubes flooded. Red lights glowed. The sea itself seemed to hold its breath. At 1900 hours, Growler struck first, loosing a spread of Mark 18 electrics at a lead tanker. Seconds stretched into eternities. Then two blossoms of orange ripped upward, the tanker buckling and exploding as secondary fires ran down its decks. Chaos broke over the convoy like a storm. Japanese destroyers wheeled hard, dropping depth charges in fan-shaped patterns. But the American boats had already shifted position. Celian surfaced under cover of darkness, using her diesels to race ahead of the panicked convoy, then dived again for a second strike. Pampanito closed from the flank, lining up on troop transports now scattering in disorder. One torpedo smashed into Rakuyo Maru, another into Kachidoki Maru. Both ships began to sink, their decks crowded with soldiers and prisoners of war, an unforeseen tragedy that would haunt the American crews after the patrol. Yet tactically the attack was devastating. For transports sunk, two tankers crippled, and escorts thrown into confusion, the Japanese response, though fierce, was uneven. Depth charges thundered through the water, but often at the wrong depth, their blasts rolling like distant earthquakes through the submarine's pressure hulls. Radar masts retracted, engines cut. The American crews lay silent as their boats drifted under battery power, evading the patterns. Sonar operators in the escorts reported phantom contacts, decoys planted by the submarines themselves. After an hour, the destroyers broke off to rescue survivors, leaving the remaining ships vulnerable. By dawn, the Wolfpack had regrouped for a final strike, torpedoing a straggling freighter and finishing off a crippled tanker. HI-72 was shattered, its cargo lost to the deep. This battle was no isolated episode. In the same month, USS Barb under Commander Eugene Fluckey prowled the Yellow Sea, sinking 5 ships in a single patrol and even launching a daring shore bombardment of a Japanese railway line. USS Harder and USS Hake hunted destroyers near the Philippines, sinking 5 in 2 weeks. Everywhere the pattern repeated: intelligence-led intercepts, coordinated attacks, devastating losses. Japanese convoys became floating coffins, their crews caught between the relentless threat below and the dwindling hope of reaching port. The sea lanes to Singapore, Manila, and Balikpapan turned into corridors of doom. Numbers reveal the scale of the onslaught. In September 1944 alone, American submarines sank over 300,000 tons of shipping. By year's end, they had removed more than half of Japan's remaining tanker capacity. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft, immobilized destroyers, and reduced training flights for pilots to a fraction of pre-war levels. Japanese industry, already strained by Allied bombing, now faced shortages so acute that some factories operated at 1/3 capacity. The Army's divisions in China and the Pacific Islands received half rations, their ammunition deliveries erratic. This was economic warfare of the most direct kind, achieved not by blockading ports, but by sinking the lifeblood en route. Psychologically, the convoy battles of late 1944 broke the back of Japanese naval confidence. Survivors spoke of periscopes haunting their dreams, of wakes materializing in calm seas, and of torpedoes that arrived without warning. Merchant captains grew fatalistic, some burning incense before departure, others resigning their commissions rather than sailing. Escort crews felt abandoned, their weapons inadequate, and their sonar unreliable. In the once proud halls of the Naval General Staff, a creeping despair set in. The realization that the Empire's arteries had been cut and could not be restored. Each lost convoy tightened the noose. Each American patrol map marked another box of ocean under Allied control. For the American submariners, these battles forged a grim professionalism. Patrol reports read like hunting logs, but behind each tonnage figure lay nights of silent stalking, hours under depth charge attack, and the constant tension of mechanical failure at depth. Men slept next to live torpedoes, their dreams filled with the sound of ballast valves and sonar pings. They celebrated victories with subdued handshakes, knowing each patrol could be their last. Yet they also understood their unique role. While carrier pilots fought the visible battles, they were fighting the war's shadow campaign, undermining the Japanese war machine from its foundations in Tokyo. Admiral Toyota and his staff tried belated remedies. Convoys were rerouted through the East China Sea. Escort carriers were deployed. Production of Kaiboken escort ships accelerated. Yet these measures were like plugging holes in a sinking ship. Codebreakers still fed the Americans' convoy schedules. Radar still revealed ships at night, and aggressive skippers still struck without mercy. By the time the Japanese convoy system approached something resembling the Atlantic model used by Britain, too few merchant ships remained to matter. The September campaign had signaled not only the destruction of specific convoys but also the collapse of Japan's ability to supply itself at all. Looking back, naval historians would mark the autumn of 1944 as the point when the Undersea war decisively intersected with the surface war. The loss of oil shipments crippled the Japanese fleet just as the U.S. Navy prepared for the Leyte landings. Without fuel, the Imperial Navy's ability to contest the Philippines invasion was fatally weakened, contributing to the disaster at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The submarines, torpedoes, had thus shaped the conditions for one of the largest naval battles in history, an unseen hand tipping the scales before a shot was fired above the waves. By the time HI-72's wreckage settled on the seafloor, the pattern was set. American submarines were no longer merely a thorn in Japan's side. They were the decisive factor in a maritime war of exhaustion. Each sinking diminished not just the Japanese fleet, but also its strategic options. In the South China Sea, off Formosa, in the approaches to Tokyo Bay, the steel sharks of the silent service hunted with impunity. This was the culmination of years of learning, innovation, and relentless patrols. The moment when American submarines truly controlled the seas, and Japanese admirals, peering at their charts, could only watch their empire unravel in the cold, dark Pacific depths. Early 1945, the effects of America's silent campaign were no longer confined to the ocean floor. They reached into the heart of Tokyo's war councils, onto factory floors starved of raw material, and into the minds of every sailor and admiral who still dared to put to sea. The submarine's relentless attrition had shifted the Pacific from an arena of decisive fleet engagements to a suffocating economic stranglehold. Japanese admirals who had once envisioned sweeping Mahanian battles now found themselves presiding over a navy increasingly chained to empty fuel tanks and decaying logistics. This was not just a tactical loss. It was a psychological implosion. The first strategic impact was fuel. By 1944, Japan was almost entirely dependent on oil from the Dutch East Indies and captured territories. Every drop had to be carried in tankers across thousands of miles of ocean patrolled by American submarines. As sinkings multiplied, the Navy imposed rationing that grounded training flights and curtailed fleet maneuvers. Carrier air groups became skeletal, pilots sundertrained, and destroyers left pierside. Even battleships that survived American bombs and torpedoes became inert hulks, their crews reduced to chipping paint instead of steaming to sea. The Imperial Navy, once the sharpest sword in Asia, had been dulled not by battle but by absence of fuel, its edge gone before it could be swung. American naval intelligence calculated that by late 1944, Japan's tanker capacity had shrunk by more than 80%. This figure wasn't just an accounting statistic. It was a death sentence for any notion of strategic mobility. When Admiral Toyota plotted the defense of the Philippines, or later the home islands, His operations staff now began with a single grim question: how much fuel remains? The answer dictated everything, from the timing of operations to the willingness to risk major fleet sorties. It even shaped Japan's entire defensive doctrine, pushing it towards suicidal kamikaze tactics and one-way missions. Since few aircraft or ships could be expected to return, the psychological toll mirrored the material collapse. Submarines became a nightmare presence in Japanese sailors' minds, a ghostly force striking invisibly. Merchant captains performed purification rituals before departure, some writing farewell notes to their families in case the sea swallowed them. Escort crews developed a fatalistic humor, referring to steel coffins not for the submarines, but for their own ships. The Imperial Navy's confidence, once built on surprise attacks at Pearl Harbor and sweeping maneuvers in the South Pacific, had eroded into something brittle and reactive. Admirals who had trained their whole careers for decisive fleet actions now spoke in guarded tones about attrition and sustainability, words alien to their pre-war vocabulary. Meanwhile, the Americans exploited their growing dominance with systematic precision. Radio intelligence fed by Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, and Station HYPO in Hawaii meant that entire convoy routes could be mapped weeks in advance. Wolfpacks no longer hunted at random, but operated as extensions of a grand operational design, coordinated from Pearl Harbor. This level of synchronization was unprecedented in naval history. It allowed the U.S. Navy to use its submarines not merely as individual predators, but as a unified net, stretching across the Pacific from the Kuriles to the South China Sea. Japanese admirals confronted not isolated attacks, but an interconnected system of warfare, what modern strategists would later call network-centric operations. The psychological contrast between the two sides became stark. American submariners, though under constant risk, carried an unshakable sense of purpose. Their radios tied them to a larger strategy. Their successes were tracked and celebrated at the highest levels. They received new torpedoes, radar upgrades, and improved sonar systems as soon as they left dry dock. Their families at home heard of their exploits in carefully worded communiques, sustaining morale. By contrast, Japanese escort crews often lacked even basic direction, their reports ignored or delayed by bureaucratic bottlenecks. The result was an asymmetry not just of firepower, but of confidence. One side acting as hunter, the other as prey. This imbalance rippled outward into Japan's overall war effort. Shortages of oil curtailed aircraft production because synthetic fuel could not be produced in sufficient quantity to power test flights. Food shipments to outlying garrisons fell drastically, leading to malnutrition and disease. Reinforcements that might have bolstered the defense of the Philippines or Iwo Jima never arrived. Each convoy lost at sea had a multiplier effect, weakening Japan's ability to mount counteroffensives, undermining morale, and forcing commanders to make impossible choices about who would be supplied and who would be left to wither. Even the vaunted surface fleet became psychologically hollowed. Battleships like Yamato and Musashi were preserved for a mythical, decisive battle, but rarely deployed because fuel could not be spared. When Yamato finally sailed on her one-way mission to Okinawa in April 1945, she was effectively a floating symbol of desperation, a battleship sent to beach herself as a gun platform because she could not be maintained as a mobile striking force. This was the ultimate expression of the submarine war's strategic impact, forcing a super battleship to become a sacrificial pawn rather than a fleet centerpiece. Inside the Naval General Staff, reports from convoy commanders painted a picture of paralysis. Loss rates were catastrophic. One convoy out of 3 was annihilated, some without ever sighting an enemy ship. Japanese submarines, by contrast, had been diverted to supply missions or futile attempts at attacking American carriers. The imbalance in undersea warfare became total. In January 1945, Admiral Somu Toyoda reportedly remarked that the sea is no longer ours, an admission unthinkable just 3 years earlier. He wasn't merely acknowledging tactical losses. He was confessing to a strategic revolution, one in which unseen submarines, guided by radios and codebreakers, had supplanted the surface fleet as the true arbiters of naval power. This transformation also marked a shift in naval doctrine worldwide. While Britain's Royal Navy had pioneered anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic, no navy had ever seen an enemy's merchant fleet so comprehensively destroyed as Japan's was by the U.S. Silent Service. The lessons were immediate and stark. Logistics are as vulnerable as frontline units, and control of the sea includes control beneath it. For Japan, these insights came too late. For the Americans, they validated decades of undersea experimentation, budget battles, and quiet technological development. By spring 1945, the undersea blockade had become so effective that Japanese civilian life began to collapse. Coal shipments from Hokkaido to Honshu fell by half. Rice deliveries from Southeast Asia dried up entirely. Black markets thrived while cities rationed power, plunging into rolling blackouts. This was the other face of psychological warfare. Not just the terror of torpedoes at sea, but the slow, grinding realization ashore that the empire's far-flung possessions had become meaningless without the shipping to bind them together. The Pacific, once a highway for Japan's ambitions, had become an American-controlled labyrinth of death. Thus, the strategic and psychological impact of the American submarine campaign cannot be measured solely in tonnage sunk or ships destroyed. It shattered Japan's grand strategy, starved its military machine, eroded its national morale, and forced a once-proud naval culture into reactive desperation. What began as a silent struggle of individual boats and skippers had become an integrated, war-winning system, reshaping not only the Pacific conflict but the very conception of sea power itself. In the war rooms of Tokyo, admirals stared at maps crowded with red ink, their shipping lanes transformed into graveyards, and understood, perhaps for the first time, that no fleet action, no new weapon, could reverse the tide rising invisibly from below. In the final months of the Pacific War, the oceans surrounding Japan resembled a vast, haunted chessboard where nearly every square had been claimed. What had begun in 1942 as isolated submarine patrols had evolved, by mid-1945, into an invisible cordon that no Japanese admiral could ignore. Tankers lay on the seabed, shipping lanes dissolved, and even coastal waters were mined and patrolled. This was no mere tactical success. It was the birth of a new paradigm in naval warfare, a revelation that the undersea domain, once thought auxiliary, could strangle a great power into submission. Japanese admirals, reviewing the wreckage of their merchant fleet and the immobility of their warships, knew they had lost control of the sea long before a single Marine landed on the beaches of Kyushu. The legacy of this undersea war is both technical and philosophical. Technically, the U.S. Navy had validated decades of investment in submarine design, radio coordination, and torpedo development. The once flawed Mark 14 torpedo became reliable, radar and sonar were refined into deadly tools, and Wolfpack tactics matured into a doctrine of coordinated attrition. Intelligence from code-breaking units acted as the campaign's nervous system, guiding the Silent Service's strikes like a surgeon's scalpel. This combination of stealth, communication, and persistence was the prototype for what military planners would later call network-centric warfare. It showed that victory could come not from a single decisive battle, but from a sustained campaign of coordinated disruption. For Japan, the lesson was searing. The Imperial Navy had built some of the most sophisticated surface warships in the world, battleships with 18-inch guns, carriers rivaling any in the Atlantic, and cruisers and destroyers famed for speed and firepower. But the Empire's lifelines were left vulnerable, protected by too few escorts and an underdeveloped anti-submarine doctrine. By the time Japan adapted, it had lost too many ships, too many trained crews, and too much fuel to make a difference. Post-war analysts in Tokyo admitted that a handful of Allied submarines had accomplished what entire fleets of surface ships could not. The near-total destruction of Japan's maritime logistics. This realization reverberated far beyond the Pacific. In the early years of the Cold War, both NATO and the Warsaw Pact drew directly on the American submarine campaign as a model. Nuclear-powered submarines extended the same principles of stealth and endurance to global oceans. Ballistic missile submarines took the concept further, transforming undersea vessels from commerce raiders into strategic deterrents capable of altering the balance of power. Even surface navies internalized the lesson, investing heavily in convoy protection, sonar nets, and anti-submarine aircraft. The undersea war against Japan had not only ended an empire's expansion, but had also rewritten the playbook of maritime power for generations to come. Yet beyond the statistics and doctrines, there remains the human dimension. The men of the silent service operated in claustrophobic tubes beneath crushing pressure, their world a mix of red-lit control rooms, oil-slicked decks, and the ever-present scent of diesel and sweat. They hunted by sound, stalked by radar, and survived only through discipline and luck. Each patrol demanded an iron nerve, each torpedo launch a leap into uncertainty. Many never returned. 52 American submarines were lost in the Pacific, and more than 3,500 submariners perished. Their victory was earned at immense cost, etched into bronze plaques and memorials far from the waters where they fought on the other side. Japanese sailors and merchants endured a nightmare of unseen predators. For them, the war became an exercise in fatalism, voyages measured not in nautical miles but in degrees of dread. Survivors spoke of phantom periscopes, of torpedoes materializing from calm seas, of convoys reduced to flaming wreckage in minutes. Their experience underscores another truth of modern war. Technological superiority alone does not win. It is the integration of technology, training, and intelligence into a coherent system that overwhelms an opponent. Japan's merchant fleet, unprepared for such a system, became its first and most catastrophic victim. The legacy of the submarine campaign also influenced American strategic thought in future conflicts. In Vietnam, planners studied the Pacific campaign to understand how interdiction of supply lines could undermine an adversary's will and capacity to fight. In the Persian Gulf, coalition navies used the same principles of surveillance, stealth, and blockade to isolate Iraqi forces. Today, in an era of cyber warfare and satellite-guided strikes, the same underlying lesson holds. Control of the invisible, whether undersea, in the electromagnetic spectrum, or in cyberspace, can be more decisive than control of the visible battlefield. WWII August 1945. As American bombers leveled Japanese cities and Soviet armies swept through Manchuria, the silent war beneath the sea had already achieved its purpose. Japan's ability to sustain modern war had been broken months earlier, its maritime lifelines severed by the submarine's relentless hunt. When the Imperial Navy ceased to function as a coherent force, surrender became inevitable. The submarines had not merely supported the Pacific campaign. They had reshaped it, draining Japan's capacity to resist and setting the stage for final victory. As historians reflect on this period, a single, striking contrast emerges. Japan built warships that were beautiful, powerful, and lethal, but isolated. America built a war-fighting system, submarines, radios, codebreakers, wolfpacks, that was invisible, integrated, and inexorable. The result was an oceanic transformation in which one side wielded power as a network, the other as a collection of ships. The outcome was never truly decided at a single battle. It was decided in the slow, crushing pressure of the deep, where torpedoes replaced artillery barges and silence replaced bugle calls. In the end, the message of the Pacific Undersea Campaign echoes far beyond the wrecks scattered across the ocean floor. It teaches that control of the lifelines, not merely the headlines, wins wars. It reveals that courage and coordination, applied in a domain the enemy neglects, can outweigh even the most fearsome surface fleet. And it demonstrates that in modern conflict, connection, information, and speed can defeat armor, tonnage, and tradition. In the cold Pacific depths, where sunlight fades and only sonar can trace the outlines of history, America's submarines proved a lesson as old as warfare itself. The power you cannot see may be the power that decides everything.